Pronto, estamos ao vivo.
Boa tarde a todas e todos. Estou aqui mais uma vez, em nome do LAEMEB do LEME, com um convidado, que tem uma palestra que será muito interessante, muito proveitosa para nós, melhor dizendo. A palestra será em inglês, mas está aberta a perguntas ao final, que peço que sejam colocadas na caixinha aqui do YouTube. Vou fazer uma breve apresentação do professor em português e uma apresentação mais completa em inglês. O doutor Lucas McMahon é atualmente pesquisador de pós-doutorado na University of Exeter, no Reino Unido. Obteve seu doutorado em História na Universidade de Princeton e antes estudou na Universidade de Calgary e a Universidade de Ottawa. E na Universidade Central European University em Budapeste. As pesquisas do professor estão voltadas principalmente para as relações exteriores de Bizâncio, para abordagens de histórias da história e do espaço em Bizâncio, e pesquisas sobre o Estado. Tem desenvolvido artigos recentemente sobre cruzadas, sobre antiguidade tardia, particularmente na revista Mediterranean Historical Review. No momento, o professor McMahon está desenvolvendo pesquisas, uma pesquisa que envolve o estudo do Império, praticamente a questão da Nova Roma, de 600 a 1200. E, ao mesmo tempo, de uma maneira geral, busca entender as experiências de império no Império Romano Oriental. Eu agora apresentarei em inglês. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is with great pleasure that I introduce today's distinguished speaker. Dr. Lucas McMahon is currently a British Academy International postdoctoral fellow at University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. He holds a PhD in history from Princeton University, and prior to that study at University of Calgary, the University of Ottawa, and Central European University in Budapest. Lucas' research focuses on Byzantine foreign relations, digital approaches to the history of space in Byzantium and the state. Recent articles have appeared in Crusades, Byzantinist Zeitschrift, sorry, I don't speak German, Studies in Late Antiquity in Mediterranean Historical Review. Lucas is currently working on his monograph entitled Information Empire and New Home, 600 to 1200, Anarchist History of Information Control, that seeks to understand the lived experience of empire in the East Roman world. Today, Dr. Lucas McMahon will share insights on establishing and maintaining the Eastern Frontier, a digital-spatial perspective, offering perspectives that will deepen our understanding of the subject. Now, I will hand it over to Dr. McMahon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a very nice intro, and thank you very much for having me at the seminar. It's an absolute delight. So what I'm going to give today is a part of an article that just came out. It wasn't supposed to come out just yet. I thought it was going to be another month or so. And then some other work that I've been doing, which is not yet published. So what I aim to do here is to get a sense of what establishing and crossing the border into or out of Byzantium was like. Well, some of this is related to my book project, Information and Empire in New Rome, 600 to 1200, an anarchist history of information controlled in Byzantium. Today I'm going to talk about some GIS, so spatial analysis on the computer, based case studies set around Antioch in the late 10th and early 11th centuries to look at how the border was built, maintained, and try to get a sense of what it was like. The goal is to understand the lived experience of empire by seeing where it intersected with people's lives through how the state collected, managed, stored, and deployed information to suit the needs of those running it. The project is fairly anarchist light in that it adopts some of the assumptions of anarchism as a way to detect state coercion. But today, mostly just going to focus on the borders. So political frontiers have long been a topic of discussion for the pre-industrial Near East, and it's widely understood that the clean lines on maps made by modern scholars were rarely so neat on the ground, then or now. Pre-industrial polities typically lacked the infrastructure or the need to demarcate territory to the same extent that modern nation states do. Despite this understanding that frontiers were zonal, vague, and fuzzy, borders still existed. Borders exist in space, but they are not necessarily of space. A treaty may define a river or a range of hills as the border between polities, but the likelihood that all of this is actively patrolled or under surveillance is actually quite small. Even today, for example, no one stands guard at the cut line that defines the Canada-US border at Waterton Glacier National Park. The border is rather the encounter between the individual and the agents of the state, and takes place where someone attempts to enter or exit a particular territorial entity. Anyone in Waterton may cross the border, but if they want to continue on down the road out of the park on the American side, they will eventually run into Customs and Border Protection agents. Similarly, a sailor might have traveled hundreds of kilometers through Byzantine waters before actually being stopped by customs officials at the port of Abydos, near the heart of the empire. The border thus exists as an encounter that takes place in some relation to state infrastructure. The urban studies scholar Stephen Graham's definition of the border as an assemblage of control technologies, in the sense of infrastructure channeling human movement, is apt. We can only discuss the experience of border crossing, though, when we understand border regimes, and these vary, even within small spaces and over relatively short spans of time. Border regimes here encompass the whole of the frontier in question, backed up by longer-term and geographically wider efforts by the state in question to enforce its borders. They include the existence or creation of new infrastructure, for example, roads, bridges, fortifications, tolls, ports, or physical geography, hills, mountains, rivers, plains. The effect of the environment on human modes of living, is transhumance a local factor, for example, and the political situation with the polity on the other side of the border. All of this needs to be considered in any discussion of a border regime. So to bring geography into the discussion of the border, we can use GIS. GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems and is a computerized way of managing, sorting, and analyzing any sort of data that has a spatial component. Here I'm using GIS to look at human movement, essentially a sort of border of possibility. The GIS does not tell us where people exactly went, but it can tell us things like how long a cavalry march takes in a mountainous area, or whether a specific plain might be too wet at certain times of the year for a longer-term encampment. It's useful for looking at borders because we can take fixed sites and explore movement through their environment in ways that we cannot necessarily do in practice today, either because a place is inaccessible or simply too far, like parts of Syria right now that I'll be getting at in a later example, or it's been urbanized or divided into private property and is thus not accessible. Much of the data underlying this is modern, albeit carefully considered, but it's important to remember that this is not a tool for generating new historical data, but rather for refining the questions that we ask through the rapid and repeated querying of human relationships between time and space in the past. So the first case study, building a border around Antioch. So ancient, medieval, and modern accounts of sieges depict dense masses of people packed together both inside and outside walls. The 8th century BC Neo-Assyrian reliefs of the siege of Lachish, now in the British Museum, are filled with human activity. In a siege on the 11th spiral of Trajan's column and set near the end of the First Dacian War, defenders fill the battlements, and most of the foreground outside the walls is taken up with attackers. Similarly, the illumination in the Madrid Scalizzes, showing the conquest of Syracuse, depicts a tight group of soldiers upon the ground, no less than 4 soldiers on a single ladder, and the battlements entirely occupied by the conquerors. The Siege of Jerusalem in Ridley Scott's 2005 film Kingdom of Heaven follows this pattern, with dozens of individuals on screen at any given time during the climactic final battle. While sieges could involve a large number of people concentrated into a small area, the reality is that many went on for weeks, months, or even years, and took place over a much greater area. The focus on the action on the walls takes away attention from matters of communication and logistics that were spread over a vast space. The capture of Antioch in 969 AD by the army of Nicephorus II, Phocas, was just such a siege. The aim of this part is to examine the spatial and chronological context of the siege of Antioch in order to think further about siege warfare in a broader spatial setting and the establishment of the first set of Byzantine borders around Antioch. So the medieval sources have focused their attention on the establishment of the fortification at Bagras. While Bagras occupied a strategic position north of Antioch with command of the eastern end of the Belen Pass, or the Syrian gates, to what extent could the location control the Amok Plain? This is the lowland north and northeast of Antioch. So I attempt to understand the siege or blockade and eventual capture of Antioch through the use of viewsheds and a cost distance algorithm. Cost distance is a GIS technique that, when combined with functions designed to account for human or animal movement through the environment, can be employed to create time distance maps from a given location. Cost distance analysis provides further understanding of the positioning of forces and brings new techniques to the study of medieval Roman siege warfare. Fortifications have often been studied as structures on particular sites, and sieges as specific series of events, often quite limited in chronological scope and primarily transpiring at a fixed place. Rather, the intention here is to look at the siege as only one segment of a wider kinetic landscape that was ushered into being through the military activities of one group trying to seize a point belonging to another. So the model described below measures cost distance by accounting for movement from or to a fixed point. In this case, the primary location of interest is Bagras, the site that Yahya al-Antaki, the 11th century Christian historian from Antioch who wrote in Arabic, he gives a name for this, and that Leo the Deacon and John Scalizzes gave attention to in their narrative accounts of the capture of Antioch. The precise routes and chronologies of the campaign are problematic and can't be entirely disentangled here. Some of the more details are in the article. The main issue arises from Leo the Deacon conflating 2 Syrian campaigns into one. What is clear is that by the time the army had reached Antioch on the 19th of October 968, they had marched a substantial distance, yet their campaign was far from over. They departed from Antioch on the 22nd of October. Nicephorus and the army set out on the road to Aleppo, but they stopped at Marat Mizrin, and the city was handed over and the population deported to the empire. The army then went south, capturing places along the way before returning to the coast and marching north to Laodicea and back to Antioch. Back on the Amok Plain, and probably arriving roughly in December, Nicephorus left 500 cavalry and 1,000 infantry and established the fortification at Bagras, which you can see at the very top in the map, a strategic site on the southern end of the Syrian gates, which pass through the Amanus Mountains. Nicephorus transformed Bagras into the administrative center of the blockade of Antioch. From Bagras, the narrative text report, forces would harass Antioch and its environs with the intention of bringing about its surrender. Nicephorus specifically did not want to take the city by storm or sack. The narrative descriptions do not disguise the fact that Bagras was at first a hastily constructed siege camp. While it is unlikely that the entirety of the fortifications were completed in the 3 days mentioned by Leo the Deacon, the location raises some questions. Unanswerable is whether it was prepared to house 1,500 soldiers by the time Nikephoros departed, but that seems highly unlikely. More applicable is that the site occupies a strategic position holding the southern end of the Syrian gates. However, Antioch is not especially close. It's some 25 kilometers as the crow flies, and this is quite far by the standards of historical siege warfare. When Belisarius marched on Nisibis in the middle of the 6th century, his army encamped some 10 kilometers, 42 stadia, from the city, although the army felt that this was too far. The Umayyad siege camp at Constantinople in 717 and 718 was based somewhere on the coast near Hebdomon, approximately 5 kilometers from the walls. A similar distance was employed by the Abbasid general al-Afshin when besieging al-Bakht in 836 during the campaigns against the Kuramites in Azerbaijan. Around 900, Leo VI in his Tactica indicated that the siege and siege camp were not identical, and that the camp should be at least 1 to 2 miles away, so that soldiers can find some respite from the noise of the siege. Roughly contemporary to Nikephoros' wars is the injunction of an anonymous military manual that states that the camp should be roughly some 6 Roman miles from the place to be besieged. While siege camps needed to be in a secure place with ready access to clean water, much as any other camp, all of these examples are much, much closer to their intended target than Bagras is from Antioch. The farthest of these is Belisarius at Nisibis, where some soldiers who were only 2 kilometers from the walls were attacked suddenly when they let down their guard to sample the local cucumbers, or so Procopius tells us. Belisarius, observing the dust cloud and deducing that the advance force had come under attack, moved up to support them and prevented a general massacre. Nothing similar would have been possible at Antioch for forces based at Bagras, particularly given that Antioch was the better part of a full day's infantry march away. Given the other examples, Bagras is difficult to understand as a siege camp in the traditional sense. While it served an operational role in controlling the Syrian gates, it was too distant from Antioch to function as much more than a station to direct the raiding of the Amuk plain, as well as function as Constantinople's eyes and ears in the area. Notably, the identified site of Bagras, where there's now a Crusader fortress on ruins, cannot actually see Antioch or even its immediate environs. A simple viewshed was used to determine this. At its most basic, a viewshed is a GIS technique that seeks to answer what locations are visible from a given point. The result is a binary of whether a location is visible or not visible, and this has a great deal of utility in matters of control over the landscape. While the development of techniques to account for the loss of visual acuity over distance, invisibility, and the limitations imposed by taking viewsheds from fixed points are still ongoing, viewsheds are useful here because Nikephoros' soldiers had a particular target that they were told to keep their eyes on, and they couldn't see it. Bagras cannot see Antioch, but the reverse is also true. Antioch cannot see Bagras. However, the invisibility of Bagras was unlikely to have been significant in Nikephoros' choice of site. Leo the Deacon mentions the hill and access to water, but at no point could anyone in Antioch see into the Syrian gates. At best, a dust cloud might advertise the presence of a group traveling through the pass, as was observed in the Ottoman Amanus by the British spy William J. Childs in 1911. So Bagras was too far from Antioch to be an effective siege camp, but its inability to see Antioch does not impose any limitations on its capacity to function as a hub for the blockade. Fortified sites that were significant enough to have ruins to which names can be assigned rarely existed on their own. Sites often possessed a range of defensive infrastructure outside of the main site, such as watchposts, guard towers, or toll stations, to enable them to control the surrounding landscape. The 9th century military manual Peri Strategias describes such arrangements: outposts and beacon stations to give warning of the arrival of the enemy, while forts should observe the enemy from a location of concealment. Such a system was determined to have existed at Middle Byzantine Efkaita in Anatolia, where, although no actual excavations were carried out, hills identified as potential outerworks of the defenses were investigated and ceramics were found. So Antioch was under a blockade, but at least from the site of Bagras and its immediate surroundings, the cordon was not especially tight. The Antiochenes were not confined to the space within their walls. The length of the blockade is indicative of their ability to feed themselves, and it lasted a year. Supplying Antioch by sea would have been difficult with Laodicea in Byzantine hands. The status of Seleucia Piraea, a closer port, is unclear. It seems to have played no role in the campaign, nor in the conflict with the Fatimids slightly later in the 990s, which suggests that it has ceased to be a functional harbor and had silted up, as much did in the mouth of the Orontes River. Antioch had an immediate hinterland of several hundred square kilometers, which could be extended in practice if anyone sallying out went out in force, which Scalidzes implies was a possibility. The Amuk Plain was a significant agricultural zone, although the extent to which late Roman irrigation systems still functioned in this period is unclear. Moreover, the blockade began after harvest, suggesting that the Antiochenes will have stored up fresh reserves within their walls. The Amuk Plain was a more fluid hydrological landscape prior to the draining of the lake in the middle of the 20th century, and that's why you see Lake Amuk here on my map. But if you look it up on Google, there's an airport sitting on top of it now. It doesn't exist anymore. And Scalidzes notes that the soldiers attacking Antioch suffered from the swampy ground and from a lack of supplies. Roman soldiers were not receiving their rations by sea earlier in the campaign, as the fleet was unable to support the army on the coast on account of adverse weather. Supply challenges for the Roman troops, though, did not mean that Antioch could not exploit the marshy ground. Wetlands teem with a wide variety of food sources, which no doubt the local Antiochenes were far better prepared to exploit than soldiers from other regions. The Orontes provided opportunities for fishing, and Childs, the British spy in the early 20th century, noted, which he noted was taking place then. Eel and carp are abundant, which also provided the possibility for the cultivation of rice. Reeds were grown to feed cattle and water buffalo, and a huge variety of avian species provided protein in the form of meat and eggs. As Johannes Coder has argued for Constantinople, the land approximately 10 to 12 kilometers out was enough to grow fresh vegetables for 300,000 people. Antioch does not offer a perfectly analogous example, as it had a smaller population and a very different territorial configuration. But the loose cordon still gave Antioch some access to its hinterland, and this explains Nicephorus's orders to ravage the land and prevent the population from moving around too freely. The blockade was conducted at a sufficient distance that Antioch could still access some of its hinterland, which provided sustenance, albeit presumably of insufficient quantity. GIS models cannot say in practice how long this hinterland extended, but it can provide an estimate. 1 hour at a cavalry march brings some 42 square kilometers into Antioch's immediate reach. 2 hours brings 145 square kilometers, and 3 extends that to 325 square kilometers, nearly reaching both Lake Amuk and the Mediterranean. The eventual length of the blockade indicates that Nicephorus's cordon strategy was only partially successful. The life of the patriarch Christopher, written in the late 10th century, gives the general weakness brought on by the raiding as one of the reasons that the city fell. Nicephorus's forces could put pressure on the food supply, but they were unable to push them into a choice between starvation and capitulation. The raiding and the cordon stressed the food supply, but did not break it. So the model employed for this was fairly simple. It's based on the principle of cost distance, namely that any movement involves some sort of cost to the one moving, and that humans and animals will generally attempt to traverse space in a way that involves minimum expenditure of energy. The cost input into the GIS is numeric, and thus the creation of the model requires the quantification of historical data, which is not necessarily always readily quantifiable. This is usually accomplished by using environmental data, particularly changes in elevation and slope. This is based on satellite data, which can be used since the basic topography of the Mediterranean basin has not changed since antiquity. Ground cover is another significant factor in human movement, although this is much more difficult to quantify, and few historical GIS studies actually incorporate this in practice. Theories and methods for factoring this in remain in their infancy. For example, in a slope-based model, the land around late antique Ravenna appears to be entirely flat and very easy to cross. The GIS does not recognize that the entire area was a marshland and thus actually very, very difficult to move through. Visibility is also an important factor to military movement, but incorporating such a thing here would mean building an entirely different model. Cultural and social factors also had an enormous impact over human movement in the past, but cannot always be quantified. In a similar matter, in-person observation is valuable, but nonetheless limited. For example, modern changes to hydrology and the presence of pesticides might commend a spot to camp for the night now that had been a malarial slough in the Middle Ages. Ultimately, in the computer, the landscape is divided into cells, and each cell is assigned a value derived from the combination of these inputs. The algorithm then calculates the cumulative increase in cost from the start point, and from this approximate times can be extracted. In practice, what I did here, I used the distance accumulation tool in ArcGIS Pro 3.0, and the final input was then run through Tobler's hiking function, which provides a mathematical basis for the change in pace, whether one is going uphill or downhill. The GIS only produces a model of potential historical movements. It does not say where medieval Romans went, what they did, or why. Nonetheless, it gives an impression of what was possible based upon the physical constraints on human movement, and when put into conversation with the environment, can provide a sense of siege warfare activities that the textual sources rarely discuss and which are archaeologically invisible. Of interest here are the small group actions pertaining to logistics and communication that took place at some distance from the center of action of the siege, but which made the entire effort function. Without troops pillaging the countryside, Antioch could supply itself and communicate with the outside world. Beyond a brief mention in narrative sources that this is what Nikephoros II intended, GIS provides a means of examining what this looked like on the ground, both at the theater and local level, and gives a sense of the quotidian siege action that is not available in any historical source. Through digital spatial analysis, the rhythms of a long-distance blockade can be imagined. Distance accumulation creates a visual representation of the cost of moving through an environment. This is purely environmental and purely one of possibility. Just because one space might be easier to move through than another does not necessarily mean that anyone actually did. It provides a quick and simple heuristic for thinking about moving through an environment in relation to a fixed location, which gives a sense of the influence that such a location might be able to put on its surrounding region. Distance accumulation visualizes the zones through which humans and their animals might move most easily. In the model underlying these results, roads are preferred movement, watercourses are crossable but generally to be avoided. I'm using a particular technique developed for looking at Olmec movement in Central America. And then it visualizes the zones which people might move. And the rate of change of elevation, the slope, is a significant factor in how easy it is to travel a given distance. Thus, in effect, Bagras is closer to places 35 kilometers across the Amuk Plain than it is to the heights of the Amanus Mountains, only 10 kilometers east-southeast of the fortifications themselves. Space is not created equally. The significance of the Syrian gates is clearly visible here, although this is also not the only route across the Amanus. The distance accumulation reveals a relative ease of movement from Bagras south towards Antioch, but also north towards Germanicaea, which is where the road heading northeast is going. It's not visible here. Notably, the edges of the Cilician Plain are also included in the zone of easy movement, connecting Bagras to the recently reconquered area. This kept open multiple channels of communication with the imperial center in Constantinople, and also notable Scott Redford's recent work on ceramics in the area have pointed that Antioch is more closely connected with the Cilician Plain than it is with places further south, where the Jebel Bakra slow down movement. Maritime and terrestrial routes around and across Anatolia also kept routes open to Constantinople. At the edge of the easier travel zone from Bagras are Tizin and Kelat Seman. This is similar to the travel zone around Marat Mizrin, where the northern extremities reach Artak, Tizin, and Kelat Saman in sort of the end of the easy travel zone, the green. This cannot be excluded, although Kelat Saman's value as a strong point between Antioch and Aleppo was actually fairly limited. while it may have served as an additional garrison alongside Tizin and Artak in helping to control the route between Antioch and Aleppo, and this is significant because Nicephorus does not want reinforcements from Aleppo coming to relieve or take Antioch. The visibility from the towers is primarily towards the northwest, which is also confirmed by photographic evidence from Oxford's Manar Alathar photo archive. Kilat Simon's fortifications cannot see the road that it supposedly controlled, although, as in the case of Bagras, the fortified site itself does not necessarily need to have eyes on the space. But it's at 20 kilometers distant, so its ability to control those roads is somewhat problematic. Kilat Saman can see the road between Nisibis and Antioch, which the road north of Aleppo intersects, but this is at a distance of some 15 kilometers as well. In theory, Bagras and Kilat Saman are actually intervisible, but at 56 kilometers distant, any sort of optical communications between the two would be inhibited by real-world conditions. And if you're interested in extremely long-distance optical communications, check out my piece in the next issue of Dumbarton Oak's papers. If Kilat Saman was garrisoned by Byzantine troops in 966, then its role in controlling the route between Antioch and Aleppo was at best marginal. Perhaps more valuable is Kilat Saman's appeal as a place of pilgrimage. During their travels, pilgrims collected and disseminated what might now be termed open source intelligence, rumor and information about political and military developments elsewhere. What Kilat Saman lacked in the ability to control nearby roads, it may have more than made up for as a listening post. That the road between Antioch and Aleppo was not deemed sufficiently secure may explain Nicephorus's decision to seize Marat Mizrin and deport the population on his 968 campaign. The breakup of the Hamdanid Emirate after Saif ad-Dawla's death in 967 presented opportunities that the empire could take advantage of, but it also presented the problem of other centers emerging in rivalry to Aleppo and Mea Faraqin. Abu Firas, the poet and cousin of Saif ad-Dawla, famous for writing his poem in captivity by Byzantium, had attempted to establish himself in Emesa in 967 and was killed in 968, demonstrating that alternative Hamdanid power centers could exist, however ephemerally, south of Aleppo. The garrisoning of Marat Mizrin is a clear sign that Nicephorus intended to control the roads both south and west from Aleppo, and ultimately secure the route between Aleppo and Antioch, with the intention of putting pressure, of course, on Antioch. With the route between Antioch and Aleppo under the control of Tizin and Artak, and supported by the more distant fortifications of Marat Mizrin and Kilat Saman, the main road to the east was severed. However, how practically these locales could harry the lands around Antioch as per the emperor's wishes are unclear. At a cavalry march of approximately 7.5 kilometers an hour, it would take troops from Marat Mizrin some 10 hours to reach the immediate environs of Antioch, because they kind of have to go around the mountains. The situation is even more difficult from Laodicea, not on this map. When time is applied to distance, it becomes apparent that troops from Laodicea and Marat Mizrin were unlikely to have much to do with this ravaging. The Byzantine occupation of these locations instead severed Antioch's key communication routes. A closer location was needed for putting pressure on the city itself, as well as attempting communications with factions inside of it, and for that, Bagras was probably a better location. Antioch was about an 8-hour infantry march from Bagras, although this includes descending from the site itself. Somebody who's at the base of the site, or the junction of the road that goes through the Syrian gates, is at a significant advantage in terms of time. However, a third of the troops that Nicephorus reportedly stationed at Bagras were cavalry. When moving on roads, horsemen from Bagras could cross the plain in a span of a few hours. Including descent from the fortress, they could reach Antioch in just about 5 hours. This figure is confirmed by an observation made by the British spy Childs, who encountered riders going from Belen in the Syrian gates to Antioch just for a day trip. Located approximately halfway between Bagras and the opening of the Syrian gates in its northwest, Such a trip confirms the GIS model's results and demonstrates that reaching the vicinity of Antioch and returning in one day was eminently plausible. Modeling the 968-9 blockade of Antioch puts Begras into its geographical context and give a sense of place and spatial relations. It lets us see Begras as more than just a temporary head of the military command that was ordered to bring about Antioch's surrender, but rather appreciate how Nicephorus's 966 and 968 campaigns contributed to the broader theater-level situation that ultimately left Antioch cut off from the wider world. It also helps explain how nearly a year elapsed between Nicephorus leaving troops in Begras in December 968 and the capture of the city on the 28th of October 969. Antioch would have needed substantial stores to survive for such a duration, but the spatial situation reveals that they probably did not depend solely on their magazines. Even a few hours' ride from Antioch's walls opened up a wide range of exploitable territories. The year 969 witnessed the fall of Antioch to Byzantium, but also the capture of Egypt by the Fatimids, an Ismaili dynasty from North Africa. As Hamdanid power crumbled in Syria and the Fatimids sought to push on to Baghdad, a clash with Byzantium was inevitable, and this came to center on the key city of Aleppo, which passed between the two powers multiple times. The two empires collided in Syria as early as 970 or 971, and control over Aleppo was a prime issue quickly, with the city seesawing between factions backed either by Constantinople or Cairo. After decades of intermittent conflict, peace was established around the year 1000. The two empires remained locked in competition until the eventual fall of the Caliphate in 1171, although during the 11th century the conflict simmered rather than boiled. Under the Caliph al-Hakam, who reigned from 996 to 1021, the Fatimids pushed the conquest of Baghdad onto an unspecified future, whereas Basil II shifted his focuses to wars in Georgia and Bulgaria. Byzantine territorial holdings in northwest Syria in 1000 were not much different than they had been when Nicephorus II marched down to Tripoli in 968, before beginning the cordon around Antioch. Tripoli was effectively outside of Byzantine control, and although the so-called Treaty of Safar ceded the left bank of the Orontes to Byzantium, in practice the empire only seems to have controlled a strip of the coast in the south and the Oinoparas Valley in the north. Antioch at this point was ruled by a catapan or a duke, so I'm just going to call it the catapanate to refer to the administrative region. It broadly has two frontier zones: the area between Aleppo and Antioch, and the Jabal Bahra, the mountainous spine that runs south of Antioch, down almost all the way to Tripoli. How the border worked between Antioch and Aleppo is difficult and will not be the subject of my attention here, and you'll just have to wait for the book. But in short, we have the treaty demarcating these borders. What you're seeing here on this map is the places mentioned in the Treaty of Safar, which survives in a 13th century Arabic historian. So most of what was agreed here never actually came to pass because the Fatimids replaced the Hamdanids, so the treaty was with Hamdanids. Antarados was the limit of effective Byzantine power on the coast, and the empire also retained focuses blockade garrisons of Tizin and Artak, as well as Kalat Siman. The difficulty with this border is that it usually seems quite loose. Intellectuals in the 11th century like Ibn Butlan and Simeon Seth moved across it without as so much of a mention of encountering imperial authority. And the Byzantine's customs house was based in Aleppo and seems to have still been working there despite Aleppo coming into control of Cairo and then back to Constantinople several times. It seems to have still been working in the 1040s when the Persian traveler Nazir Khusro was there. Such extraterritorial frontier management is not unknown in Byzantium. Kherson and Venice functioned in a similar way in an earlier period, and later we can see tax officials operating in Timotarakan up in the north of the Black Sea in the 1180s. But back to the mountains. So Nicephorus II, John I, Basil II, and Romanus III all led major campaigns into Syria over the course of about a half century. But prior to the 1030s, the Jabal Bakra, these mountains running from south of Antioch all the way down to the bottom of the map here, barely make an appearance at all. And even then, they really only show up in Yahya al-Antaki, the 11th century Christian Arabic historian's history. However, al-Antaki provides a valuable snapshot into local frontier management in a small geographic space during a short time span. Al-Antaki's narrative of the events in the Jabal al-Bakra is a coherent and detailed unit, set right after the defeat of Romanus III at Aleppo in summer of 1030. The story is extremely complicated, and it would take me about 15 minutes to walk you all through the details. So, in brief, the Catapan of Antioch, the Byzantine governor, released a prisoner named Musharraf, who had apparently been arrested twice before, who promised that he would build for the empire a fortress at Menikos. We do not know who this guy was, but presumably he was some sort of tribal leader from the Jabal al-Bakra. We also do not know what was required of him other than to build this fortress, but presumably he was to rule in the uplands in the empire's name and keep the peace. Musharraf, however, proved to be a problem. He did not hand over the fortress once it was built. Then he decided to build another fortress, this one at Bekisrael. You can see here a little bit south of Antioch. But this time, the Catapan had learned his lesson and took no chances and drove off Musharraf's men and constructed the fortress there and garrisoned it. Romanus's defeat outside of Aleppo and the subsequent dismissal of this Catapano from Antioch resulted in a power vacuum that gave local actors in the Jabal al-Bakra the opportunity to strengthen their hand. And two further tribal groups, we don't really know their relations with each other or with Musharraf, also went and built fortresses, one at Balatunas, which is not very far from the road connecting Antioch to the major port of Laodicea. Raids and counter-raids took place over roughly the span of the next year. Byzantine control in the uplands south of Antioch had crumbled, and things got worse when the Fatimid governor, based in Damascus, tried to improve his position there as well. Yet, although the situation spiraled towards all-out war between Byzantium and the Fatimids when the Fatimids tried to back Musharraf, and all of this was started by some local Arabs trying to improve their positions in the mountains, imperial pragmatism ultimately prevailed. As Byzantium started to get the upper hand over its former clients, the Fatimids backed down. Why? Again, geography, and again the GIS, can tell us useful things about relative positions on the frontier, or so I'm going to argue. So the GIS technique employed here is the least cost corridor. The least cost corridor is a relatively new tool to ArcGIS Pro, although the concept of cost corridors is much older. It's intended to provide a solution to some of the problems of the least cost paths. Least cost paths are at the technical base of what I discussed earlier, and they're a computational technique that divides the landscape into cells and assigns each a value reflective of their relative difficulty in crossing that cell. Very similar to the time distance analysis. It's a similar technique. It sits at the base of the pyramid here. While many models simply use slope as a cost, a wide range of physical and social factors can be employed. Least cost paths are widely used in archaeology as a simple means of investigating connectivity. It's widely understood that they are not a means of modeling where precisely people traveled in the past, but are rather a general heuristic. Human travel is far more complex, and any path assumes a perfect knowledge of the environment, which nobody actually has. Moreover, they also require defined start and end points. This, however, makes them useful for things like urban planning and the military, both of which have an interest in getting from point to point as efficiently as possible, or with certain stops along the way. A variety of methods have been proposed to overcome some of these limitations in least cost path analysis, ranging from simply making more paths to entirely new landscapes, or entirely new techniques that conceive of the landscape in a different way, like circuit theory. Least cost corridors, however, are designed to avoid some of these problems by generating a visual of the landscape that represents the approximate difficulty of moving through it from a particular point. The basic issue that least cost corridors solve is that of the single result. A standard path analysis produces only one line, a line between the start and end points, despite the algorithm having gone through the entire landscape. The danger here is that other least cost paths might only be marginally more expensive than the one shown, are not displayed, even though they could be very, very different. A radically different route through the landscape is possible, but it's not made visible. The least cost corridor avoids this problem by representing the entire landscape as a zone of costs. It will not explain how people traveled in the past, but it will give a visual sense of a region where one can travel from or through at lower cost than others. So once the cost surface was created, the creation of distance accumulation rasters was carried out. The least cost corridor tool requires 2 of these, and since virtually no known work in the humanities has been published using this technique, I had to do some experimentation. It's been used in ecology in the past for looking at how wildlife move around, but I've never seen it used for human movement. So the initial plan was to pair sites on opposite sides of the Jebel Bakra. So Antarados and Homs, Marrakeus and Masya, Balanea and Shazar, or Larissa, and Gabala Apamea, and then run another analysis from north to south using the Aleppo and Tripoli as the 2 starting points. This didn't actually work. The Jebel Bakra is not so difficult to traverse as to inhibit all movement. Since the east-west pairs of points are so close together, the lack of distance made them visually indistinctive, such as, for example, the relatively flat plain between Antioch and Aleppo actually came up as being more difficult than some of these points in the mountains. So in the end, 4 distance accumulation rasters were prepared, centered on Antioch, Tripoli, Aleppo, and Homs. The idea being to have them one west of the mountains and one east, also one roughly Byzantine and one roughly Fatimid. These were then paired, Antioch to Tripoli and Aleppo to Homs. Although these pairs created corridors that do not cross the Jebel Bakra, they follow the main known road routes on either side and represent the outside imperial perspective of access to the mountains. And as we see on these ongoing campaigns, prior to the 1030s, nobody actually records anybody entering the mountains. Presumably small groups did to secure the allegiance of locals so that they're not going to get their camps raided and their baggage trains pillaged as much as possible. But the historians prior to these events in the 1030s simply ignore these mountains and they don't exist. And Nicephorus and Basil II simply go around them over and over and over again. So the second GIS process carried out here is the viewshed. The viewsheds taken here should be considered preliminary and are merely suggestive of a more complete, and are suggestive that a more complete study should be done that takes into account visibility of the fortress itself from surrounding territory, as well as fuzzy viewsheds to account for the degradation of visibility at distance and in specific weather. On-site investigation would be an advantage in any study of these fortresses' visibility, but the current political situation in Syria makes that somewhat difficult. This is also the area where the Russians have their base. Nonetheless, the viewsheds were conducted with 2 specific questions in mind. How far up and down each valley can a fortress see, and are the fortresses intervisible? So the least cost corridors give a sense of access to the Jebel Bakra. The inland corridor, built from the distance accumulation rasters that connect Homs and Aleppo, does not directly pass through the mountains. This was by design. This mountainous region, following all the political activities in northwestern Syria in the late 10th and early 11th century, as recorded by Al-Antaki and Skalidzes, was peripheral until the 1030s. This does increase the cost in the result, in that they are not directly in line between the 2 origin points, yet all the fortresses are within yet another color band, indicating further cost to access them. A closer view that refines the color band nonetheless puts the fortresses in the hardest access zone from the Aleppo-Homs corridor. In effect, getting to Antioch is easier than getting to these Jebel Bakra fortresses from somebody coming from inland Syria. And on this point, I should note that I was doing this analysis right during the last round of fighting in the Syrian civil war, and when the new government forces pushed west, past Aleppo, they washed up against the mountains, and they did not pursue. They did not enter, and then they turned south to Damascus. Now, part of that is that the Russians have their base in this area, but it was also nice to see this sort of proved in real time, that these mountains were not the easiest thing to access, and they were not the highest priority, which they were also not in the 11th century. So in effect, getting to Antioch from inland Syria is easier than getting to some of these upland fortresses. Moreover, a trip between Aleppo and Homs that went on the coast around the Jebel al-Bakra is actually easier than going into the Jebel al-Bakra. The Antioch-Tripoli corridor tells a different story. Unsurprisingly, the flat coast is easy to traverse. The fortresses of the Jebel al-Bakra, however, are much easier to access from this side. Balatunis and Bek Israel are located in places that are harder to get to, but the valleys are easy to enter from the Mediterranean coast. They may be on imposing hills, but one can get to them relatively easily. All of the fortresses are located in such a way that they are roughly at the edge of the accessible zone from the coast. This also works in reverse, so that anyone controlling the heights could descend on the coast with impunity. Notably, going beyond the fortresses further up the valley becomes increasingly difficult. The Jebel al-Bakra are hardly insurmountable. The highest peaks barely exceed 1,500 meters, and the whole range is only 35 kilometers wide. Yet no evidence points to Byzantium trying to take control of the region prior to the events of the 1030s. The fortresses were not sited according to Byzantine design, but rather by local actors. While Byzantine support aided in building Menikos, it was Musharraf who conceived the project. The only other fortification work we hear about being carried out was at Marrakeus, and that's on the coast. The view sheds of most of these fortresses are comparatively limited. None of them are positioned in such a way that they can see much beyond their immediate valley. Notably, they are not intervisible, so an optical communication system is out of the question. The matter of the specific siting of these fortresses should be sought in the rhythm of the life of the people who lived in these mountains, a matter that cannot be addressed here. At least for the first half century following Byzantium's return to Syria, whatever arrangement had been made with the inhabitants of the Jebel al-Bakra worked, or it worked well enough that nobody writing from Constantinople had cause to mention it. And it was only following the emergence of a strong man who had demonstrated his resistance to empire on multiple occasions that the Katapano was forced to take action in these mountains. Al-Antaki's account of the fortress war in the Jebel al-Bakra may be an unusually detailed moment in Byzantine frontier management, but the general outline of the story is familiar from other times and places, particularly late antiquity. However, clients and frontier management has been little discussed in the empire after the 6th century. Romano-Byzantine frontier management has a long history of empowering locals, only to cast them down again with some regularity. The prime example of where this ultimately failed was with Alaric in the 5th century, but in contrast, the establishment and then the liquidation of the Jaffnids in the 6th century was much more successful. That Byzantine authorities had arrested Musharraf twice suggests he was on a list of potential big men. The payment of tribute and military service in this case is unclear, although at a minimum keeping the Jebel al-Bakra out of the orbit of the Fatimids seems certain. Typically, empire penetrated into the borderlands sufficiently to prevent the formation of independent-minded groups. The location of the fortresses made them attackable from the Mediterranean roads, and the danger of the inhabitants of the Jebel al-Bakra having fortified positions was that they became less vulnerable to a rapid Byzantine strike, and thus the destruction of the client state. Aleppo again illustrates this problem. While Aleppo's excellent fortifications were a special case, the struggle over the city since the Byzantine return to Syria provided a vivid example of just how much trouble a client ensconced in a fortress could be. That Musharraf could appeal to the Fatimids is exactly the issue. Fortresses bought time for the defenders to seek out aid from other powers. They are no longer purely at the mercy of Byzantium. This may seem an obvious point, but it connects directly to the other unique aspect of Al-Antaki's account of the Fortress War, that of the peace process between Byzantium and the Fatimids. Al-Antaki shows the move towards a lasting peace taking place on two levels. Both Cairo and Constantinople had instructed their frontier commanders in Damascus and Antioch to sort out issues on the ground to prepare for a lasting peace, while also managing the logistics of the embassies that would eventually travel between the two capitals. They also suggest that at a ground level on the frontier, even empires locked in cosmological, ideological struggle cooperated as much as they fought, because keeping down locals who sought to leverage distant imperial power for their own gain was more important to maintaining the whole system of imperial extraction and rule than whatever local gains might be achieved. The clients were ultimately expendable. The inhabitants of the regions did not get a say in this. Based on the least cost corridors, Musharraf would more likely have been a problem for Byzantium, hence the tentative Fatimid support. However, once Byzantium gained the upper hand in the fortress war in the Jabal Bakra, the empires were not willing to let local actors stand in the way of peace. Rather than reinstate the situation of the dueling clients on the desert frontier in the Caucasus between Byzantium and the Sassanids in late antiquity, the two empires opted for more direct rule. And notably, it worked. Peace did not always prevail over the next half century that Byzantium remained in Syria, but no large-scale hostilities broke out. Thank you.
Okay. Professor Fabiano?
Hello, sorry, we have a technical problem. Thank you for your lecture. Indeed, it is fascinating. It's important for us, for our public, for our graduate students. So we have a more basic questions. Guilherme will make some, and I will make some after Rin. Okay, thank you so very much. Guilherme, please.
Okay.
You make
Okay.
the two questions, and then I will make the other questions.
Okay. So, just wait. Lucas, thank you very much. Great presentation. I had some classes on digital humanities and GIS last semester, so it was interesting to see that apply to Byzantine studies. But I have two questions that go a bit beyond. First of all, and sorry to go back to this, I'd like to return to the debate on borders. Sure, Byzantium wasn't a modern nation state, but the idea of borders and markers of imperial power seems pretty clear in our sources. How do you see this? Does your research engage with this issue? That's the first question. So,
Okay, so I think I agree entirely that borders are a real thing, and the empire attempted to enforce them probably more in certain times and certain places. I think the real difficulty that we get is that there is abundant evidence for efforts to demarcate and control borders, but there's also quite a bit of evidence of people seemingly passing through without any sort of controls.
yes.
And I think the difficulty here is trying to reconcile how this actually worked on the ground, because a lot of this comes from, or all the evidence is very widely scattered. You can go from the 5th century to the 12th century, and you can find evidence of borders, and you can also find evidence of fairly uncontrolled borders. So how I think this worked in practice in general is that the state attempts to channel human movement through certain times and places. They want people passing through on major roads, and most people are traveling on major routes because after all, unless you have some sort of local knowledge, it's going to be quite difficult to get just about anywhere. That said, they're not patrolling all the space. There's a wonderful story in Gregory's Decapolites' Vita, where it's the 9th or 10th century, and he really wants to do some good asceticism and get away from it all. So he decides his little mountainous retreat somewhere in Macedonia is not cutting it anymore. He's going to go to Bulgaria. So he does. And he establishes his hermitage in Bulgaria, and after a while he leaves. And he comes back and he tells his disciples that he was nervous about it because he had crossed the border, and he didn't have a crucible proving that he was supposed to be on the other side of the border. So this gets down to the question of how do people prove that they're on the right or wrong side, and who's enforcing this, and how does it work? One could hypothetically say that perhaps there's some sort of travel papers that are being stamped and sealed at major points of entry. There's evidence for this for merchants on their goods when they're getting taxed, but for individual travelers, there's no evidence. I still suspect that's actually kind of probably how it worked, but there is simply no evidence. The other major aspect of border control, I think, is it's class. That unlike today, where now you can go and buy a Cypriot passport if you're willing to invest €1 million or whatever in Cyprus or in Malta or somewhere, where class eases your way across the borders. It was, I think, the opposite in Byzantium, and we get repeated accounts of people who are sneaking across the borders, particularly into the caliphate and out of the caliphate, where they dress as monks or herdsmen. Suggesting that people are being watched, but pilgrims maybe not being watched very carefully.
Okay, thank you. The second question is, besides the general difficulty of mapping the Middle Ages, are later sources usually a problem for this kind of digital approach? I'm asking this more as a personal question. I've been advised to map the local impact of the Crusaders, but we often run into the classic issue of having to rely on much later sources, like Anna Komnene, who was writing years after the events. So how can we consider this when we try to make a map which is not a neutral map? It's like there's different kind of layers there to interpret.
So I think the answer to this is as carefully as we can, while also acknowledging that a map creates a false sense of correctness and precision that doesn't actually exist.
Yes.
So, for example, one of my favorite things to do when I get a new book on ancient or medieval Near East is to open up to the maps and look if the 20th century Euphrates dams are on the maps. And whether whoever was making the maps simply just, took some modern geodata and never thought about it, that actually Turkey built these dams in the 20th century, just as, the Lake of Antioch here, it doesn't exist now. It did exist then. It didn't exist in antiquity. So, you have to try to do this as best you can. Roads, similarly, are a constant problem. We have the Tabula Imperii Byzantini, and while yes, it is true that path dependence means that people tend to take the same roads over a very long period of time. Most of what they have are coming from 19th century Ottoman Ordnance Survey maps. So one just has to be careful with it as much as one can. I think in general, in terms of physical topography, unless there are major hydrological changes or something, which you take a look and you try to figure it out, the basic topography of the Mediterranean basin hasn't changed since the Holocene. unless you get an artificial lake or a quarry or something. A bigger problem is simply the quality of the data. So a lot of these sort of the elevation models that I'm using, they're coming from NASA. They're publicly available, but they're 30 years old. They're full of holes. There are quality issues. There are endless articles discussing how people try to improve or make it work. Much better stuff is available if you have money or access to military satellites, neither of which I have. So you do what you can, and you attempt to acknowledge that the maps are not necessarily truth. The maps are, in some sense, a form of misdirection, making things look more solid than they actually are. And I think at the end of the day, the important part is to sort of remain historically humble and use it to ask historical questions rather than necessarily trying to create certainties in space that we necessarily can't always come down with.
Okay, thank you. So do not use OpenStreetMap to present you, because it's crazy. Because I have seen that. Okay, but
I think you use what you've got available. I mean, Google Earth is a problem for, like, if you want to do high-end analysis or something, but for just taking a look at the landscape, like, it's quick, it's easy, it's useful, go for it. Like,
but for a book, it's maybe too.
Yeah, for a book or an article, like, use it carefully.
Yeah. Okay. Professor Fabiano is.
Dr. McMahon, I have a little question. The last question, I think. A basic question. How can we standardize the collection of information for a geolocation program? What are the main challenges involved? Some examples.
It's very difficult and very problematic, because especially when looking at data from the pre-industrial world, it's essentially bespoke. Basically, I'm building my own every time for every individual project. And the question of how do we build a world that we don't need to do that in would be really nice. So what I've been doing is now sort of creating a file of where I collect all my vector data. So spatial data with just an X and a Y and a Z component. So basically points and lines, and putting it into one archive with the eventual hope of publishing it in a format that would be useful to someone else. But the problem is that cleaning this data into a publishable state and putting it all together and then getting it out there in a way that will, be shareable and can be practically useful is really quite difficult. What would be nice would be to have some sort of repository where one could then both visualize data on some sort of online mapping tool and then download it for actually using it. But unfortunately at the moment, Lucas's collection of various things from his dissertation and articles doesn't make for a particularly nice thematic coherence. And I've done up other things, like I did all the Tabula Imperii Byzantini roads for Anatolia, which took an insane amount of time, and they're still not good enough to publish, and we're still missing the West Central volume. So I don't want to put it out there because it's not ready. I've done the point data for the Tabula Imperii Byzantini for Bithynia. But it feels too minor to publish. What one would ultimately like is to have something like Harvard's Atlas of the Roman and medieval civilizations, and have it in a way that one can easily pull the data off for analysis, but also know that it's reliable. And there you have a problem because, for example, you pull out their Roman roads and they look great on a map, but they're not analysis grade. And unless you were to actually take a very close look at them, you wouldn't even know this. So yes, creating quality, clean data that can be published and used in a wide variety of platforms remains a serious problem. And while this is something that's been at the back of my mind since I've been starting to do this, I don't have a critical mass of data that I'm ready to publish unless you want some point data on Greek fire, which would be fun, but it's not, really important in the same way having a set of roads or something would be.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for your lecture. It was important for our students, for us, and I hope I will see you soon in another opportunity. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me.